We go straight into the panel. We've got about 30 or 40 minutes. And first of all, introduce the panel. We've got Ian Boardley, who's a sports psychologist. He crosses over between, I suppose, organised sport through to what we're classing as fitness doping. He's also an international expert on moral decision-making, in particular within sport. Willem de Ronde, we've already heard, a clinical psychologist, and it's good he crosses from, I suppose, the hard science, but also with a lot of real-world experience of working directly with anabolic steroid users. Amanda Atkinson is not just the lead researcher, she has a background in the theory behind drug prevention and a lot of experience as a qualitative researcher. Marija Anđelković, really pleased to have on here, who's a medical doctor, works with the Republic of Serbia Anti-Doping Agency, and has worked not just on intentional doping but also unintentional doping, and has published in that area. So I've got a couple of questions which I'll have in reserve, but it's really to open it up to yourselves. We've got different views, some of it will coincide, probably some from different perspectives. Do you have any questions for the panel as a whole or for individuals within that panel? And don't say no.
Can I just make one correction? I'm not a psychologist, I'm an endocrinologist.
Did I say psychologist? Yeah. I was so busy concentrating on getting your name right, I forgot you were an endocrinologist. I do apologise. Questions? Okay, I'll open it up. And obviously we've got limited resources nationally and internationally. Where should we invest the finances? From your perspectives, what should we be investing? What should be the main focus? Can I start with you, Marija?
Yeah, of course. Since this is my first time I saw you, just thanks for the invitation to the organizer. I'm here actually instead of my colleague Professor Dikic, but anyway we are coming from Anti-Doping Agency of Serbia, the biggest in our region. We are working with the athletes, but anyway, we are working with the non-athletes, how is most of the presenter told us today, non-sport recreational people. I can just tell you a few experiences that we have in our work, just a couple of sentences. Regarding the e-learning, we are lucky one that by our law, the best athletes from our country, and that's a huge number of them, more than 500 from all the sports, are obligated to have a 2 times in year education about the doping. So it's not voluntary, it's obligated so they can receive their scholarship. That means that 2 times a year we meet the best athletes in our country and their coaches, doctors and all the people who are working with them, and we are giving them a lecture about the prohibited thing. We started working that 2011, and after 2 years it become very boring to give them a lecture about what is prohibited and what is the prohibited list. And we started doing the lecture on the other side, which is probably near to your story, and that is what is actually allowed. What they can do, and that give them muscle, strength and everything. So in the last 5 years we are actually giving a lecture, e-learning and on live lectures about nutrition, supplements, and I'm happy that like 2 months ago we give them a lecture about the body image, so it's going overlap with your presentation, because they are all, for example, give us a question about the Game Changer, the big movie. I don't know how much people of you saw that movie. And so that's how we learn what is actually interesting for them. And we have e-learning for 6 years. That means that most of our lecture we just make a video, put online, and some of them we make a quiz so they can solve and they can get a certificate that they finished some kind of the anti-doping education, and that's obligatory. We We are one of the actually rare agency that give the, we call it opinion about the supplements and the drugs. So we have application for the mobile phone, and they like it they like it most than everything else we invented, because it's approachable, and they ask the opinion, is it okay to take this kind of drug, and they just fill it in a 1 minute, the application for the drug. And the one thing that we are doing, and the other colleagues are not so happy to do it because it's very risky, we are giving them opinion about the supplements. Are there having any kind of prohibited ingredients by the declaration? And we, of course, we put a frame that we don't know what is in the box. And the third thing that we developed with our doctors is actually with the European Union. We had a big project where is developed the tool how the medical doctors can recognize the sign and side effects of the counterfeit medicine. So it was the big European Union project about the counterfeit medicine, and actually the most of the anabolic drugs are counterfeit because they are legal, they are not legal, they are false one. And the athletes or recreational people are just buying it on the black market. So if I have to choose what has the most impression for the athletes and the recreational people, it was actually our lecture that was done by the e-learning also, with the examples. So I think that the thing that we see today with the concrete example and the study is something that they're very interesting. The most of the lecture that we give to the athletes is ending up with the question, oh come on, but did anybody really die from the steroids? So they just want the total extreme thing you show them, and usually we have from the newspaper this young teenager die because of the abuse of the steroids, and it's sad story, but those things are really hit them. They like to see that kind, because they don't believe the bad things can happen. So the nice thing, just back to your question, none of this is actually very expensive. To make any kind of video or e-learning, if you have like a decent budget, is not expensive and it's approachable. Even those applications for the phone now, you can make it very easily. So the budget for us in the future will be regarding that, just to develop more and more e-learning and develop the application we have.
That's great. Thank you. Could we go to you, Ian, and can you say a little bit about your work? Because I don't think we know about you yet.
Okay, yeah, I can say a little bit first. So most of my, as Jim briefly mentioned, is around the area of sort of morality and how moral functioning can influence drug use, in particular image and performance enhancing drugs, both in sport and non-sport contexts. And my particular focus has mainly been on something called moral disengagement, which is a series of psychosocial mechanisms that people use to rationalise and justify doing things that are potentially harmful either to the self or to other people. So quite often in sport we're thinking in terms of potentially the competitive advantage or unfair competitive advantage if we're using image and performance enhancing drugs to get a benefit that's outside the rules. So how do we rationalise and justify doing something that gives us an advantage over our competitors who are not doing that? In the non-sport context, in the recreational sort of fitness context, it's more often centred on the harm to the individual person themselves. How do they rationalise engaging in that behaviour? How do they downplay the potential side effects? And as I mentioned, these are psychosocial mechanisms, so it's that interaction between the individual and how they rationalise it, but how that's influenced by the environment that they're surrounded by. So one mechanism that most people would probably be familiar with is something called diffusion of responsibility, where we don't feel personally responsible for a behaviour if it's something that we perceive that lots of people are doing. So in sport, we often think about cycling in the 90s and Lance Armstrong and this, if everyone's doing it, it can't be wrong. No one person in that environment takes personal responsibility for that. In the gym context, if you're training in a hardcore gym where potentially in some situations 60, 70, probably more, 80% of people might be using steroids, that's very easy for you. It's much easier for you to rationalise that behaviour in that situation, because people start to tell themselves, well, it can't be that harmful, it can't be that damaging, because lots of people are doing it, and the individual doesn't take responsibility for that. So, yeah, a lot of my work's been around that area, qualitative and quantitative research, looking at what leads to people using these mechanisms, but also the links between these mechanisms and actual use of iPads. But in terms of where I would invest money, I think I would probably invest money in prevalence at the moment. I think we've seen from a couple of the presentations today, I think Lambros in the first presentation highlighted that in some studies we're seeing the low end 3 to 4% prevalence. In other studies you're seeing 18 to 22%. Same thing if you look in the UK, what the available data is. If you, we've had quotes of people estimating 1 million users, but if you use the National Drug Survey, then you're looking at 60,000. We really don't know what the extent of the issue is. And then if you extend that to think about the typology of users that Jim presented on, we now know that there are different types of users, and if we think about the interventions that we've heard about, we know that if we target the interventions at a particular type of users, then the interventions are probably going to be more effective. But if we don't know what the prevalence really is, and we don't know how that breaks down into different types of users, then we can't develop those interventions to specifically target those groups and target them probably at the ones where we've got the greatest prevalence. So I would probably invest money in getting a much better understanding of what the prevalence of the issue is.
Okay, thanks, Ian. Amanda?
Yeah, I would definitely agree. We need to keep developing the evidence base, and it's vital that we do that to obviously inform the development of interventions. But I think generally, as Jim presented this morning, the evidence base around the effectiveness of interventions is quite limited, and lots of things exist, but we just don't have, or the money hasn't been there available to have evaluations of those projects. And I think that's not only important in terms of going forward to look at the effects, but we know from the wider literature around substitute interventions that some interventions can actually have adverse effects, and they can have the opposite outcome of what they intend. And I think that's always something that we need to consider also.
Thank you.
I totally agree that we need evidence for harm reduction strategies to find out what is actually effective. So we are planning actually to do a harm reduction study to find out if any intervention we can do is, well, secondary prevention, and because they are already using, might be any effective or might even have adverse influence. A second thing is that what I learned from the data, at least I learned from the data I showed, is that we need more facts because, well, we studied how harmful it actually is, and to be honest, it was not quite what I expected. To be honest, it was less harmful than I suspected, based on my 10 years experience with the anabolic outpatient clinic. So I think it's really important, to tell an honest, to make an honest picture to the users, what we really believe, what the harms are. And I think really that they are very interested. I mean, the patients, the subjects we saw in our study were really very interested in our data. So I think it's important to have more facts to base our policies on.
Great, thank you. Can I open that up to everyone else? If they have any comments on the suggestions of where we spend, or do people have different views on where that investment should be? Any thoughts? Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Two questions. One is to Ian. I know you've done a lot of work on morality, and morality is an important pillar of anti-doping education in competitive sports. Do you think there is issue with morality in recreational sports? And it is morality or ethics?
I think it's relevant to the recreational fitness community, but to some people in the community, but not necessarily everyone. I think in the sport context, if you're committing to play a sport by the rules, then that should be relevant to everyone in that context. because you're choosing to break the rules if you decide to use image and performance-enhancing drugs. I think in the recreational context, I think it's probably influenced by someone's upbringing and their personal values in terms of whether they see this as a moral issue. And we've definitely seen from our qualitative research, we've interviewed people that have used steroids and have chosen to stop using them because morally they couldn't rationalise it with themselves, it didn't feel right. But then other people who continue to use and can rationalise it, but to them they see it, we've still got quotes from people seeing it, it feels as though it's wrong, and then you get the rationalisation. So, and then you get other people that it's not, it doesn't seem to be a moral issue for them at all. So I think it needs to be a consideration potentially in intervention, but I don't think it's necessarily as important in the fitness community, and it needs to be just one component alongside many others as well.
We were very much puzzled whether we should include in our educational material topics about morality. We were used from our work in competitive sports to definitely have morality, but it was difficult to see how recreational athletes would see it. So that's why. Thank you.
Can I just pick up on that point? And you mentioned over, I suppose, morality and rules, and how they apply, I suppose, for organised sport, but probably don't apply for in the same way for the other people who are using anabolic steroids. And if I could start with you, Marija, is there a tension there for the NARDOs to lead on this, where I suppose there's a zero tolerance in organised sport, whereas maybe there's more of a harm reduction or a pragmatic response outside of tested sport?
Well, you have an example that is old, like 2 days. You know that Russia is suspended for next 4 years in different kind of level regarding sport. One of the level is that probably some of the athletes who cannot prove that they are pure or clean, they cannot go to the competition, Olympic Games and world competition. And the reaction of some athletes is actually that they were very happy. They didn't even thinking about is there any clean athletes there, you know, because regarding morality, and the morality should say, okay, I'm against that all the people who didn't use drug, they shouldn't be prohibited to go to any kind of competition and so on. So there is a huge area to work on what is ethic and morality in the sport, because yes, athletes need to be educated about that. I mean, who is working with athletes, he knows that they don't have experience regarding that. They are not taught about that. So anything they bring from their home about the values is mostly, if they don't have a good coach and the good people around them, it's maximum they get. So one of the questions I want to ask is actually, what is the age limit? I mean, if we are talking to the old person, like a very elite athlete who has 25 years and all the model in his head is already, developed, how you can influence on him to say that something is good or bad, because he already has his own attitudes that are developed during his career. So we try to do something on that level. We have a lecture about the ethic and the moral. We are doing that. Mostly because I'm telling you, it's a little bit boring to only talk about doping and everything, and they actually like it. They like to see for example, now you have this big affair with Nike and all the athletes who were just didn't say anything, and they were doped actually under the umbrella of the biggest sport firm in the world. And again, that was the morality of them to just go approach and say, okay, I was jeopardized. So, and I didn't say anything. I was actually, somebody forced me to dope and I didn't say anything. So we can just say what happened with their attitude, what happened with their courage to just go in front of all of them and say, I didn't want to do that. So it is a very, it is a very wide area to have any kind of education on that level, and I think it will give results in the future. So just my question is for you, is there any like age limit when you say that it is too hard to influence on somebody's opinion about the values?
I think it probably depends on the individual. I don't think you can say there's an age cut-off. It probably depends on their own experiences and their own social environment that they've been around, and the parental upbringing and the values that have been instilled in them. But I certainly agree that the values-based education, which is something that WADA are very keen on NADO's including in their education plans when the new international standard comes in, will be much more effective if it's targeted at children. I think the values-based education is probably of limited value when you've got people that have already developed their attitudes towards iPads, and certainly someone who's developed a positive attitude in terms of the functional use of steroids and other drugs.
That's very important, yeah.
Yeah, and then it's probably, for those athletes, probably the information around how to avoid inadvertent doping is probably more important, because not everyone at that, even if they're adults and have formed their attitudes, are choosing to use performance-enhancing drugs, but they might still be at risk of inadvertent doping. So that information is important, and I think obviously testing is important at that point as a deterrent as well, and effective testing systems, and the values-based education is probably better targeted at the younger athletes, and it's important that information is getting to them before they get to a testing pool and start
because
to receive,
we sometimes forget about the children. We don't educate them. We are just focused on the adults, and we forgot that maybe that should be the focus. Because, for example, in our country we had a good example with the peer education. It was surprising us. In 1.5 years we have from 9 girls who we educate to be a peer educator, we had 10,000 children in the primary and the high school educated about the abuse of the prohibited substance, and they want to educate, and now it's going on without our control anymore, but they were interested in the topic. So sometimes I think we forgot about that level of the children and the adolescents.
Yeah, and it can probably just be included in a whole topic of discussion around integrity in sport at that point. It doesn't necessarily need to be just around drug use. And I think, but if the first experience of an athlete is for someone coming and testing them, then it becomes about avoiding the tester and not the decision making itself, which I think is, yeah.
But to widen that, and I suppose when we talk about the prevalence figures, we don't really know, but in general, we see that the majority of those are not in organised sport in any way. Does that question of morality, is it relevant for in a society where it's not illegal, it's a society where we can drink ourselves to death or eat ourselves to death? Why would this be something to tap into? Is it completely different?
I think definitely the approach for NADOs that are working in a situation where they're operating in competitive sport and in recreational of fitness context, I think a different approach is definitely needed. It needs to be much more focused on harm reduction in the fitness context as opposed to sort of the prohibition stance in sport because of it being outlawed in that context. But I think morality is potentially still relevant because people might, quite often people have a misunderstanding around drugs, so people often think that they are illegal, and the legality of a substance influences our moral values and our moral opinion of a behaviour. In some countries it is illegal, so that's been influenced as well, and then we've still got those personal values of some people that are just brought up to think that the behaviour is wrong and it's immoral, and for them, when they've got those values, then I think for them it's potentially relevant. But I think there are many other areas that need to be focused on in education in those settings alongside it.
Well, can I move to you and just ask you, for those, the people in your study, what would have convince them to either, well, to stop using or to have not started in the first place? Are there any levers that could have been used?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, really don't know, to be honest. When I see, well, not so much in the study, but when I see patients in the outpatient clinic, mostly they're older, have 10 or 20 years of experience in anabolic steroids, and they want to stop. And then I ask them, well, can you advise me what to tell the young guys about what you know now and how that may influence them? Well, they don't know either, actually. Yeah, they say, of course, you get older, you get wiser. And the problem is that the ones that I see, they have a problem, and that is perhaps a minority of them all. Well, what I think is that it is it's always a balance between the positives and the negatives of using steroids. I mean, when you're young, and especially when there is a lot of emphasis on muscularity, and using anabolic steroids, of course, can help you a lot with reaching that goal. And they, so in these young guys, there is, the positive outweigh the negatives. And when you grow older and muscularity is not so much important anymore, then it tips the balance, and the negatives are bigger than the positives. So we talked about morality, which I don't think really is an issue in the recreational user. So I'm not a psychologist, but what I'm wondering about is the emphasis nowadays on social media and public opinion about muscularity, and what you showed in your comics, etc. Actors and all guys on YouTube and Instagram, etc. with the muscularity ideal picture. How much is that influencing those guys to start using? That's the question that I have. Maybe one of you can comment on that. And should we, as healthcare professionals, make a statement about that? That maybe that is something that we should address.
Yeah, I think there's various studies on body image more generally, looking at media influence. It's always difficult to obviously show cause and effect, because to do that kind of study is really complex, and we just don't have the conditions where anyone's never been exposed to media, so it's difficult to show cause and effects. But I think it would be silly to say there's no influence there. Suppose in terms of how we approach the issue, we've been talking about things at the individual level, education, obviously treatment, etc., which is really important and relevant. But thinking about the wider substance use field, the alcohol field, when we think about advertising regulation, we're thinking about regulating media content. I think this issue is relevant to those broader questions around media regulation, and that be due to impact on health. Whether that my own work's around alcohol, media representations and marketing, and I think we need to look at the way and how the wider environment can be. Should it be regulated in relation to what images of body image are being, airbrushed and things like this? I think, we need to generally think beyond kind of the individual when it comes to, how to approach use and harms.
Okay, thank you. I was going to set you up with a question. Wait for me to set you up. Does anyone know of anything with any other public policy where there's been successes in public health that we may have some learning from? Oh, I think we have someone in the audience.
Thank you. Yeah, well, two things. I was going to say that the whole issue with morality, I think in recreational sports, okay, let's say doping, as you say, might be legal, but what about nutritional supplements? They're not legal. Would they define morality? Are we okay if they're using 14 different supplements a day? Is it still healthy exercise as we want people? Because we forget that we want people to exercise for the health promoting aspects of exercise, right? Not just because of the looks or the appearances. So doping is immoral, but doping is legal, fine. In a competitive sport, you might make arguments about illegality and morality. In recreational, does that mean that they're fine to use any other kind of substance that is still not illegal, but might be illegal maybe in 2 years' time? That's one question. But that's to be addressed later. With respect to what you said, I personally believe that yes, definitely, at least from tobacco control studies, we have a lot of things to learn. A lot of things about the marketing of steroids, access points, availability, accessibility, prevalence, how do we define prevalence, how we set benchmark criteria to define lifetime prevalence and changes in the behavior. I think there are a lot of, I see a lot of crossover between the two fields, and I happen to have worked for 10 years in both of them. So 10 years in smoking, almost 10 years in doping. So I think there is a lot of crossover and very good practices and examples that we can take from one field to another.
Sounds like they need investment.
Definitely, definitely.
Anything anyone wants to chip in with at this point? Okay, I've got two more questions, or something that I suppose has been nagging at me is we focus very much on men. And I mean, it's good we've got a gender split here, but the discussions have been predominantly about masculinity, muscularity. Are women underserved? We know the prevalence is lower, but are we actually doing enough for that population? Should we start again at that end?
Probably not. And I think, as I discussed in my presentation, that the tool was very much focused on anabolic steroids. We know that a small proportion of women do use those substances. But if we're talking about image performance more generally, then we've got a whole range of other issues and substances, whether that be lip filler, which is completely normalised, particularly in certain sections. Just thinking about the UK, it's literally just like, you know, going to get, it's just so normal, it's like brushing your teeth, it's going to get a haircut. And I think if we take that broader definition of image enhancing, then from a gender perspective, there's a whole range of issues that I think are completely under-researched, absolutely. Anyone else wants to?
Well, one of the problems in our clinic is, as I said, we've been doing it for 10 years now, and I only saw 3 women, 3, that's all. So, I mean, that's not a lot to do to research, actually. So it doesn't seem to be a problem, at least as when you talk about anabolic steroids.
Yeah.
Can I just pick up on that before we go to it? Just to say that I think there might be an explanation for that, in that it's probably a behaviour that's much more secretive in female users of steroids. So that because there's been, I think, more widespread acceptance of steroid use or awareness in the public, especially amongst men, and certainly in some subgroups it's probably seen as a positive behaviour in some male subgroups. I don't think that's ever the case for female users. Therefore, it doesn't seem to be a behaviour that. So we're extending our research on harmful use of steroid use at the moment to females, and it's a much more difficult group to access to engage in research, but when you do, one of the key themes that comes out is that they're much more secretive about the behaviour because it's just not seen as something that they want to be associated with. But on that point, so I think in terms of steroids, they're probably underserved, but even if we accept, and you know, we probably all accept that the behaviours, the prevalence is much lower in female users, we also need to think that, or probably accept that the harms are potentially much more damaging as well in female users. So we might have a lower prevalence, but if the potential harm is much greater, then we still need to be aware of that group.
Can I just put one caveat? We're speaking as male researchers saying about the harms, and if you look at some of the information, qualitative information from female users, there's some of the dynamics going on there. I do take your point.
Yeah, so what one person might see as a harm might not be someone else's harm. So that
and our perception of what women should be.
So we shouldn't. No, that's a good point. But I think in terms of whether females are underserved more generally, if we look at other types of drugs and diet pills, and so iPads as a classification more broadly, then I think our obsession with steroids in terms of research. And
it's fish in a barrel.
Yeah, that's right. Means that we do underserve that population, because if you look at the research on steroids, it's dominated by males. But if you look at the research, certainly before the last 5 or 10 years on body image, it was dominated by females. But we don't do the same in terms of drug research on what's leading to or trying to facilitate those body image concerns that females have. So I think we're underserved.
Drugs research in general,
yep.
Very male-centric, and you know, including whether that's from the design of interventions to services through to actually conducting research and who we target. It's, you know, I think that applies to and generally to drugs research and probably lots of other fields of research as well. But I think going back to kind of the issue of morality and obviously stigma that I discussed briefly this morning, stigma is always multifaceted, and gender is a key component of that. If services are designed with men in mind, then an additional kind of barrier will be that, and you know, a woman accessing a male service doing something that might be perceived as masculine, there's that issue there, and which will impact on engagement with services as well.
Just one thing regarding the body image with the ladies and the female. I don't know, did you heard, but like a few months ago, there is no more cheerleaders in the NBA and the National Baseball League in America, because they told that their body image was so influencing the public and the fans that they actually came to watch them and not to watch the games and the athletes. So that is the distraction or totally opposite side of this one, but there is a body image with the female body, but it's totally different, yeah. And it can be a problem, as you can see. Yeah.
Could you go here?
Yes, finally my turn. Well, we have this information service that Marija talked about that Christine is running, and about 1% of the 400 who have used the service are women. We also have a study among female prisoners. 6% had a lifetime use of steroids. Among substance use disorder treatment patients, 11%. But they are so few. And we also have a qualitative study among 16 female users of anabolic steroids. And when asking them about what they need from the health service, they do not want to go into addiction treatment, the service. They use their general practitioner or a private psychologist or a gynecologist. They do not seek endocrinologists. Unless they have used, like one had thyroxine and got some severe problems according to that. So I think when it comes to women, they are hidden groups, and I think we need to inform general practitioners actually, to be honest. I think that's and we have these nurse specialists that reach out to young men and women under 25 years. It's a free health service. That's also a place to go. But it's definitely an under-researched area. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Can I
ask one more question? Because, as I said, we had 3 women, and one of them was a transsexual, actually, female-to-male transsexual. So I wondered, well, you have very small numbers as well, but do you think there might be a gender dysphoria issue among female anabolic steroid users?
That's really a difficult question. And actually, I can't answer when it comes to the qualitative study because based on anonymity, but it seemed to be maybe a few cases. And we try to cooperate with the transgender treatment service in Norway. Astrid Bjørnebekk, our colleague, is cooperating with them. But it's a good question, and we don't know enough about it. But then I think we have to go into the transgender treatment service to know more about that. Yeah.
What I found interesting in the work that was done at John Moores with female users was the power dynamics of the women who completely gave themselves over to the dominant male within the gym environment. It was complete faith in everything that they were told, and that loss of autonomy was really concerning.
Sorry, can I, just to pick up...
I'm not going to have the last word then, am I?
No, I just wanted to say that so Tony Knox's work with female steroid users, certainly just to pick up on this final point here in terms of transgender communities, certainly that isn't something that's come through in our work today, and certainly the dominant male was certainly a strong influence in many that Tony's interviewed, and often that's the partner as well that can be very influential in the decision making.
Yeah.
Thanks. You have the last word.
Thank you.
Since we brought up the issue of health, one of our biggest problems with education has to do with athletes' resistance to accept the information about the health side effects of doping. So when we say that doping use may harm your health, they say it won't happen to me. So when you elaborate more and say this will happen, this happened to a lot of people, then say, okay, all these side effects are reversible. So okay, I will stop the cycle, and in 2 or 3 months I will be perfectly okay. So what should be our counter arguments on this? Do we have some robust evidence about the long-term effects of doping use?
I think sometimes there's a lack of faith in the credibility of information because of, well, it still exists today, but the use of scare tactics. And, you know, it applies to all drug use. If you're using something and the information you're being given again and again doesn't reflect your experience and doesn't reflect the experience of your peers, then any future information going forward you're not going to see as credible. And I think that, again, applies to the wider substance use field, absolutely. And going back to the conversation before, we need honest information. And if that is that, you know, the harms, you might not experience the harms, they're reversible, then pragmatically that's the truth. And, you know, long-term effects can be discussed, but we know that there's, you know, the evidence base isn't as strong, and people, especially younger people, think in the here and now, and it, you know, it raises questions around how to discuss the long-term impact.
Yeah, I completely agree, and that is one of the bigger problems, of course, that it is extremely difficult to have long-term studies. I mean, the study we started now is only 1 year, and we'll have two-year data, but I already know that we will not see any major problems in 2 years in this population, and it may take even 10 years or 20 years, and it will be very hard to have this cohort followed 10 or 20 years. And even then, it's only 100. I mean, it took thousands to study the harmful problems of smoking, for instance. So that will be an enormous problem for the coming 10 or 15 years.
But you're aware of the Swedish hormone abuse clinic where there is a 10 of young people die during their treatment. You know that.
Yeah, I know
we
that
use those slides for the athletes because they...
I know the Danish study which was published, which showed that there was a survey among... because in Denmark, as you'll probably know, they can go into gyms and check on the public. And they found that indeed in those who were tested positive, mortality and morbidity was higher. On the other hand, these may be biased, of course, by all sorts of things. We already saw that anabolic steroid abusers may be tempted to do other things that we see as unwise, using drugs and violent behavior and etc., etc. So that may really be a problem when you look at these data.
I think one other thing to say on that is that even if you had that evidence of the harms, the long-term harms, that wouldn't necessarily influence everyone's use. Some of the work we're doing is with people that have already experienced quite significant harms and still continue their use. So there's still a subpopulation there that would continue use when they've experienced it themselves. So then you can imagine what that would be in terms of you just giving them evidence that might be the case. So I think it's only going to have a limited effect on some groups because there's often some quite deep-seated psychological drivers that can be influencing the behaviour that even information on long-term effects might not offset.
Yeah, and generally people, you know, some people are willing to take risks. So if we think about drug-related deaths more generally, some of the more recreational substances, the prevalence of deaths is quite low, and most people can take drugs quite safely, especially if they're given harm reduction information and environments are made safe. It's I forgot my main point then. What was the death? So we can talk about the long-term harms that death. You say 10 individuals, but in the kind of grand scheme of things, people will tend not to reduce the sadness of those 10 deaths and the impact that it had. But in the grand scheme of things, that's not the biggest concern. And I think people see through that. People are aware of that.
I think that alongside the other points that have been made, the other thing to remember is that whatever information we give, and even if it's credible information, it's probably drowned out by a lot of misinformation. Yeah. So we're probably just a little voice amongst many other voices coming through social media and the gym community that they're operating with. And that's a motivated population that are motivated to see the benefits of the behaviour and not the negatives. So we're always going to be that smaller voice, I think. So that's something else to bear in mind.
I don't disagree with any of those points. I think that the visual imagery of the changes to the brain structure are quite a powerful message. Obviously not for everyone. I think we're going to have to draw an end to it. But I'm going to squeeze in one question with one sentence answers from people. Seeing as we're in Finland, what do you want for Christmas? Anything? It can be doping related, doesn't have to be.
Is that a serious question?
I'll sort it out for you.
Is it a secret Santa?
Yeah. Any final words from anyone?
I wanted some new Converse, and I think they arrived in the post. I think my partner bought them the other day, but he doesn't know I saw them. So.
Thank you for that.
Just remember we're live online, so if he's watching...
I would just use the opportunity to say that today I heard so many useful things. Your presentation were excellent. So this is totally new approach for us who are coming from the National Anti-Doping Agency, because we are always thinking like black and white, and this was something different. So thank you. We will incorporate everything we heard today in our experience and work. Yeah, it was useful.
Okay. If you can join me in thanking the panel and thank you to everyone. Thank you.